You do not need to love going to the farmer's market to want to do great seasonal cooking. Fall is one of my favorite times of the year. Once the temperature starts to drop, I'm all about those delicious, comforting fall flavors. Any time of year, when I think about autumn cooking, it just makes me happy inside. So today I'm making 3 recipes that can be cooked during any season because these ingredients are available year-round, but really to me embody the best parts of cooking during this season. I'm making a butternut squash soup with smoked paprika, brown butter, and roasted Brussels sprouts, a delicious fennel dusted pork roast with an apple pancetta ragout and roasted kale, and finally the classic French caramelized apple tart with 5-spice and a maple cream. It is not only delicious and visually stunning, but with a few tricks I'm gonna share is surprisingly easy to make. So let's dive right into the butternut squash soup. I started with 1 butternut that I peeled fully and then trimmed the ends off. I cut the ball part off first, split it in 2, and then scooped the seeds out. Then I sliced it thin, split the top in half, and sliced that as well. I added 50 grams of unsalted butter and 100 milliliters of heavy cream to a cold pot, and I cooked it over medium heat until it broke and then eventually turned brown. Adding cream to butter when you want to brown it is an amazing trick because it increases the amount of milk solids, which is what turns into that beautiful brown stuff floating around and adds a tremendous amount of extra flavor and color to the finished butter. Once this is taken on a deep golden brown, turn the heat off and add 10 grams of smoked paprika, and optionally, I set some aside so I could put it onto the finished soup for some added color at the end. Then in went the sliced butternut, 500 milliliters of water, and some salt. Put a lid on, turn the heat down to medium-low, and while it's cooking, let's roast the Brussels sprouts. I started by cutting all of the ends off and then splitting them in half. Then I put them onto a tray and seasoned them with an extra virgin olive oil and some kosher salt. I tossed them and then put them into a 400-degree convection oven for about 8 minutes until they're this beautiful, deep golden brown. Once the squash breaks apart easily, it is tender and fully cooked. You can use the classic potato masher here, which is honestly one of my favorite kitchen tools, but a blender or stick blender will give you a creamier soup. These are powerfully delicious ingredients, but there's only 3 of them, so seasoning with enough salt is very important. And once the Brussels sprouts go on, adding that beautiful reddish brown butter on top really makes this plate pop. Now onto the second dish I'm making, the pork roast. The 3 recipes I'm making today actually work as a cohesive menu, but I can't remember the last time I cooked a multi-course meal at home. It might have been when I was in culinary school literal decades ago. So while all 3 of these recipes do go great together, they also work just as well alone. And I'm doing them one by one because they're much easier to follow. But if you are interested in actually cooking more than one of them in a single day, I'm gonna leave in the description the order of steps that I think you should do them in to optimize your time. That said, let's jump into this delicious pork roast. Pancetta is made from pork belly just like bacon, although it's not smoked and it's rolled up. So I unrolled a thick slice of it and diced it up. Then I added it to a saute pan with a little bit of olive oil over medium heat. While it's crisping up, it's time to work on the apples. There are actually 3 types of apples that we're using in this video: Honeycrisp, Conzi, and Granny Smith, which all offer different flavors and textures, but broadly there are 3 types of apples you'll find: eating apples, cooking apples, or dual-purpose apples, which cook well but also taste great on their own. All 3 of the ones that I'm using today are dual-purpose apples, so feel free to use any combination of 1 or all 3 that you'd like. That said, I'm using Honeycrisps for this sauce because they're consistently super tasty. My favorite way to process them is with this little thing called a melon baller. This is not exactly a common kitchen tool, but if you do happen to have one lying around, it is amazing to scoop out the bottom stem and the top stem and then peel it off, split it in half, and use the baller to scoop out the seeds. This way you'll get the most possible amount of apple that you can eat. That said, I'm assuming most of you guys do not have one of these things lying around in the back of your tool drawer. So when we get to the tart, I'll show you how I do this without one. Then I dice the apples up and set them aside. We're also adding some very flavorful hard herbs into the sauce. Here in the United States, you can buy something called a poultry pack, which includes sage, rosemary, and thyme. All 3 of them go very, very well with a lot of these flavors. And this is optional, but I do like to tie up my herbs with a butcher twine into a nice, neat bundle that I can easily pull out once the cooking is done. And no one's gonna end up with a thyme stem stuck in their teeth, but you can also just toss the herbs in and pick them out at the end. Once the pancetta is crispy, you have both delicious, crispy meat and a bunch of fat, which is also delicious, but I do like to take some of it out. So I threw a paper towel in and stirred it around to sop up some of the grease, then threw the towel away. Next up, I added half a minced onion and cooked it over medium until it's nicely caramelized. Once this is looking good, take everything out of out of the pan, add back a few tablespoons of butter, and once it's foamy, turn the heat onto high and throw the diced apple in. And cook them until they're starting to take on a light golden brown color. Then back in goes the onion bacon mixture and a bottle of pilsner. I really wanted to use Bitburger because I love it so much, but it's tough to find here in the United States. Thankfully, any pilsner will work. I really like pilsner for this because it's a pretty clean tasting beer, but it's got some really nice hoppy bitterness that I think will add a lot to the sauce. Then I added in the herb bundle and cooked it down until most of the liquid was gone and the sauce is starting to thicken, and then season it with salt. And it's time to roast some pork. You can buy any sort of pork roast that you'd like at your market, so feel free to skip this part, but these boneless loins are the best deal in the meat section. This thing cost less than $2 a pound and came in at $19 for a whopping 10 pounds of meat, which is almost all usable. And all you need to do is trim the silver skin off. Starting at the very end, slide your knife under the silver skin and then cut out to make a small flap to grab onto. Then turn your knife around in the other direction, and while it's still laying flat against the meat but angled ever so slightly away from it, saw your knife down, and you'll feel the silver skin just sliding right over your knife. This is as easy as it looks, and while it does take a few practice runs to build confidence, this is the best cut to practice on. Then you'll portion them into roasts. With pork loin, about 3 fingers wide is a good portion per person. Pork and fennel is one of the most classic combinations in Western food, and it is a delicious one. So I ground whole fennel seed in a mocaete, which just absolutely demolishes these seeds. But a spice grinder is easier and faster. You just want to make sure you have a fine powder. Season your pork well with kosher salt. Dust it heavily with the fennel seed, and we're gonna pan roast it. So I got a black steel pan nice and hot over high heat and added plenty of grapeseed oil. Then in went the pork, and as soon as it goes in, turn the heat down to medium because unlike beef, you do not wanna char pork deeply. You want it to be more of a deep golden brown like chicken. And you're just gonna want to occasionally roll this around the pan to get a deep golden brown color on all sides while you work on the kale. No matter what they say at your grocery store, you are really gonna wanna wash this stuff. So grab the thick end of the stem with one hand and then pinch it lightly with the other and pull the thick end of the stem away from your 2 fingers and you will strip all of the leaves off. Once you've done that, set up a little washing station. The only way to really thoroughly wash any vegetable is to fully submerge it in water, stir it around a little, and then lift them out of the water. And you'll see on this first rinse just how dirty the vegetable is. If you have any visible dirt floating around on your water, you're gonna wanna dump it out and repeat this process up to 3 or more times. Then I chopped it up and we can set this aside as the pork finishes cooking. I like to temp my pork to about 150 degrees Fahrenheit before I take it out. This is entirely your personal preference. Some people I know like their pork medium and others like it absolutely hammered. The reality is here in the United States, trichinosis, which is the main pathogen that's historically been carried in pork, has been basically eliminated from our supply. So if you're in an area where it's not a concern, the only thing you really need to worry about is texture. And a lot of people prefer the texture of well-done pork. But I think if you pull it around 148, 150 degrees, you're going to get a nice balance of fully cooked meat that's still holding on to a lot of those delicious juices. Once it's a little shy of this temperature, turn the heat very low and add butter and some of the poultry herbs, and then just baste it for a few minutes until it comes up to the right temperature. Then set it aside and let it rest for a few minutes while you cook the kale. I used a paper towel to wipe the pan out, then added some fresh olive oil and a very large few handfuls of chopped kale. Season all of the little nooks and crannies, but remember, this is going to cook down a lot, so it's very easy to over-season it. I roasted it over medium heat, stirring occasionally until it's starting to brown nicely. Then I added a handful of sage leaves and cooked those for an extra couple of minutes. This combination of flavors is absolutely delicious. It's really like fall on a plate. I finish it with some Malden sea salt, fresh lemon juice, and coarsely ground black pepper. Now, my friends, it is time to dive into the deep end of French tart making. There's a lot of different types of tart doughs, but today I'm keeping it simple with one that I think is easy, but also uses a neat trick to create an amazing result. Any crumbly dough will include sugar, but I'm also going to use vodka in it, which is not for flavor, but because it has some incredible textural advantages, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. I added 150 grams of all-purpose flour, 50 grams of cane sugar, and 75 grams of cold diced butter into my food processor. This can be done by hand, but I never do that at home because the food processor turns what is actually a pretty unforgiving and messy process into one of the fastest and easiest things you can do in pastry making. You're going to pulse this on and off until it looks a bit like coarse sand, then add 1 egg yolk And while the machine is running, pour in about a tablespoon of vodka that you've let chill in your freezer. Vodka is mostly ethanol, not water, so it will naturally lead to a lot less gluten development, which is the enemy of great texture in this type of pastry. It also evaporates much more readily than water once it goes into the oven, and the drier the pastry gets, the better its texture. You'll never actually be able to taste the vodka in this dough, unless it's eaten raw, which I would not recommend. The specific amount of vodka you should put in will change seemingly day to day, but it's actually quite easy to judge how much you need, which is very little. Just add enough so the dough starts to look like it's gonna come together. Then immediately stop adding vodka and let go of the pulse button. Less really is more here. We're gonna rely more on the next step in order to keep the dough together. So dump it out onto a sheet of plastic wrap, fold the plastic over, and then with your hands thoroughly press it until it looks like sort of a thick pancake. And then put it into your refrigerator to rest and cool down while you make the caramelized 5-spice apple compote. I'm using Granny Smith's here because they make a great tart, somewhat chunky filling. And this is how I clean an apple without a melon baller. First, peel the apples and then split them into half through the stem ends. Then split those halves again. And finally, with your knife on an angle, remove the entire center. Then dice the apples into large pieces and put them into a sauté pan. And you can totally just use your pan lid, but I love this cartouche technique where you use a sheet of parchment paper to make a custom sized lid that vents beautifully and is actually purpose built for something like this. Take a sheet of parchment, fold it in half, and then fold that in half again. And then making sure that the corner of the folded parchment that would be at the center of the sheet if you unfolded it stays as the pointy end. Fold it like you're making a paper airplane over a couple of times. Measure it so that the sharp end is sticking right in the middle of your pan and cut it at the edge and then cut the tip off. When you unfold this, it turns into a custom-made pan lid that lets just the right of moisture out to create that beautiful caramelization. I season these apples with a little bit of cane sugar and plenty of Chinese 5-spice. Then put the lid on, turn the pan onto medium-high heat, and cook it until the bottom layer of the pan is starting to look caramelized. You're gonna stir them 3 or 4 times, and in between, let the pan start to get that beautiful shade of dark brown. Then add 250 milliliters of water. Cook it for just a few minutes until the filling is still chunky but is just starting to fall apart. I'm using a classic 9.5-inch tart mold. You want to butter the mold thoroughly to make the removal process easier, and now that the dough is cold, take it out of the fridge and use a rolling pin to start pounding it evenly one side to the other, then give it a corner turn and do the exact same thing. You want to repeat this at least a few times because cold butter has a plasticity to it, and this pounding will help enormously to prevent the dough from cracking when you roll it out. You can do this with flour on your table, but I would strongly recommend putting it onto a sheet of parchment paper and then covering it with another one. It's gonna make this whole process so much easier and faster. Roll your pin directly away from yourself, then roll it towards yourself. Repeat this a few times and then do a quarter turn and do it again. This does not have to be perfect, but what you're shooting for is that the dough is even all the way around. And when you put your mold in the middle, there's extra to cover up the sides. Beyond that, this dough really is like Play-Doh. If there are uneven portions or things that need to be fixed, it's gonna be very easy to do it. If the dough starts to feel too soft, just put it in your freezer for a few minutes. Once you're happy with it, pull the top off the sheet of parchment. This is where using parchment really shines, because if your dough is stuck to the parchment and doesn't want to pull off, just put it in your fridge or freezer like I just mentioned and let it cool down for a little while, and then it will peel right off. Once you've done that, lay it onto either your forearm or rolling pin and unroll it onto the mold. Then lift the edges away and press them into the corners around the entire tart. Because I did do this in one shot and my tart dough at this point is definitely starting to warm up, I had to throw it in the freezer for a few minutes so the parchment could peel right off. Now take a look, and if there's any gaps or thin spots, use the extra pieces of dough that are above the mold to press in anywhere you need to. Once you're happy, roll your pin over the top so that all of the extra is cut off. Any tart dough will benefit from being chilled at this point, so throw it into your fridge while you start working on the apple rosette. I'm using these Kanzi apples because they're delicious. And I use the melon baller technique to remove the stems, split the apple in half, and then remove the seeds. Now it's time to thinly slice them. This is a great way to practice your knife skills, but this is also exactly what a mandolin was made for. Use your first couple of slices to dial in the thickness. You don't want them to be paper thin, but you also also want to be able to bend them without breaking. Pro tip, try to keep them in the piles they fall in, which will make the layering process that you're about to see that much easier. Any apple that is cut will oxidize, some faster than others, which you can slow down by mixing them with lemon juice. But if you're set up to do this without stopping, you should not have a problem. But if you'd like, you can do this next step where we add the compote into the tart mold before you slice the topping apples to give yourself a little extra time. Now it's time to create the rosette, which may look super complicated, but in reality, if you follow these simple techniques, it should come together quite easily for you. Put the tart directly in front of yourself, then layer 3 or 4 apple slices away from you. Make sure that you have some overlap hanging off the edge of the mold because these will shrink in the oven. And also make sure that when you look at it, you're not looking at the square cut edges, but that it looks like this and what you see are round apple edges. Once you've done this first layer, you should have the confidence that you can do the rest of this topping with no problem, because all you have to do now is slightly turn the tart mold and repeat the process with another 3 or 4 slices, then turn it again and make sure you're always laying apples away from yourself. Just do this until you've got an entire outside layer. For the last couple of slices, you're gonna have to lift up your first slice to tuck them under, then just repeat the process with another layer to cover most of the center of the tart. Make sure to overlap this layer a little with the previous one because this is all gonna shrink in the oven. And for the center rosette, which for the record is entirely optional, just take whatever slices you have left that are on the smaller side of things and overlap them with the cut side pointing in until you have something that looks like this. Personally, I am a visual learner, and I bet at least some of you guys are as well. So if you look at this and it makes sense, you should consider ignoring the instructions and just follow what you see. Bonus, if you have used a melon baller, you can use the stem scoop in the middle to help stabilize the tart and really complete the look. Once that's done, brush it with melted butter and dust it with plenty of 5-spice as well as a nice coating of sugar. While this tart bakes, some of the butter is gonna drip out of the separated style molds. So if you're using one, you're gonna wanna bake it on a sheet tray. But because the oven in my apartment is currently not working and I have to use this little guy, I used some folded up foil. Cook it at 425 degrees for 8 minutes with the convection fan on. If you don't have a convection setting, use 450 degrees instead for about 8 minutes until the edges of the apple slices that are hanging over the edge of the mold start to brown. Then turn the temperature down to 350 degrees and cook it for 45 more minutes. Most tarts will benefit from a longer cooking time. So if it looks like it's getting too brown too quickly, don't just take it out of the oven. Instead, turn it down to 325 or even 300 degrees and keep going. As the tart dries out and the butter and flour start to brown, the texture and flavor will massively improve. If you don't have a convection setting on your oven, you're gonna wanna rotate the tart halfway through. While that's baking, I'm gonna make a quick apricot glaze. I honestly wish I could use the actual apricot glaze, but the smallest amount you can get is like 11 pounds, which would take me probably the rest of my life to go through. So I like to use apricot preserves to make a quick one. Start with a spoonful of apricot preserves and a little bit of water to help them melt, and then cook it down until it's a nice syrup and strain it. Once the tart is done, it looks great, but it's gonna look even better once it's glazed and taste even better with a spoonful of maple cream on top. So let it cool down for a few minutes while you work on whipping the cream. You can use a balloon whisk to do this, but my preferred method is to fill one bowl with ice, then sprinkle salt on top, and then take another bowl and press it into the ice. I added 200 milliliters of heavy cream and started whisking back and forth until the cream started to thicken. And then optionally, you can start to whisk in sort of a more upwards circle to make the cream fluffier. Either way, once you see that little peak that's formed on top not flop down, pour in 75 milliliters of maple syrup and stir that in. It is important to get the cream to stiff peaks because the maple syrup is gonna loosen it somewhat. And this way you'll land in the end with a nice, soft, and extremely delicious cream. Keep it on ice or put the bowl in your refrigerator while you glaze the tart. I'm using the removable bottom type mold, so that needs to be lifted off first, and then brush the tart liberally with the apricot glaze. This does add some flavor, but more than anything, this is for visual appeal, so it is entirely optional. This tart is not only a great balance of tartness and sweetness, but it's also a real crowd pleaser, especially if you make sure everyone sees the whole thing before you absolutely demolish it. There are a lot of techniques to dive into in this video, and I hope you've learned something or at least gotten inspired to cook up something delicious. I know when I first learned how to make this type of tart, I was fascinated at taking a peek into the process of how some of these more visually complicated pastries were made. And I'd be very curious to know what you guys think about this format, so please let me know in the comments. But anyway, that is all for me on this one. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon.